From New York, this is Democracy Now!
My name is Pauli Murray, and my field of concentration has been human rights. My whole personal history has been a struggle to meet standards of excellence in a society which has been dominated by the ideas that blacks were inherently inferior to whites and women were inherently inferior to men.
My name is Pauli Murray. A new documentary from the directors of RBG explores the remarkable life of Pauli Murray, a groundbreaking legal scholar who influenced Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Thurgood Marshall, and a civil rights pioneer who was arrested 15 years before Rosa Parks for refusing to give up a seat on a segregated bus. Pauli later helped found the National Organization for Women. Pauli also became a priest and is now a saint in the Episcopal Church. Pauli Murray is also viewed as a hero to many in the trans rights movement. We'll speak to the Academy Award-nominated filmmakers Julie Cohen and Betsy West, plus Dolores Chandler, a trans writer and social worker featured in the film.
We've been taught to believe that people like us don't exist. So when I came to know and learn about Pauli Murray, I was so amazed and wanted to hold it so tightly. And also I was angry. I was so angry that I felt in some ways that I had been robbed of a part of my history.
Pauli Murray for the hour. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States reported another 4,000 deaths from COVID-19 Thursday, as a fast-spreading coronavirus variant first seen in South Africa was detected in South Carolina for the first time. Daily U.S. infections have been on the decline after shattering world records earlier this month, but remain at extremely high levels of about 150,000 per day. Disease experts worry new variants, coupled with fatigue over masks and social distancing, could lead to another surge in cases. Here in New York, Attorney General Letitia James said Thursday Governor Andrew Cuomo's administration undercounted COVID-19 deaths at nursing homes by as much as 50%. Just hours after James' announcement, New York Health Department officials added nearly 4,000 nursing home deaths to New York's tally. Drug maker Novavax said Thursday its COVID-19 vaccine showed nearly 90% efficacy at preventing disease in patients in a large clinical trial in the UK. But worryingly, the Novavax vaccine showed only a 50% efficacy rate in a smaller trial in South Africa, where a new variant of coronavirus has been spreading rapidly. The Novavax immunization is a protein-based vaccine that trains people's immune systems to recognize the spike proteins that surround the coronavirus. Several mutations in the South African variant led to changes in the spike protein that can help it evade immune responses. At the World Health Organization, Emergencies Director Dr. Mike Ryan said vaccine makers may have to tweak their formulas as the coronavirus continues to evolve.
Look at influenza. We change the vaccine composition twice a year for the northern and southern hemisphere, and we're able to issue vaccines very, very quickly to combat the predominant flu strains every year. So there's no reason, even down the line, if this virus evolves to a point where our vaccines begin to lose effectiveness, we can adapt those vaccines. And I believe we can adapt those vaccines quickly.
President Biden signed an executive order Thursday restoring mandates of the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid that were undermined under President Trump. Biden's order also adds a new special enrollment period for people to purchase a health care plan through the federal insurance marketplace. That period runs from February 15th through May 15th.
There's nothing new that we're doing here other than restoring the Affordable Care Act and restoring the Medicaid to the way it was before Trump became president.
The U.S. economy shrank by 3.5% last year, the worst drop since 1946. The Commerce Department reports the economy grew by 4% in the last quarter of 2020, but that was not nearly enough to offset declines earlier in the year. Another 847,000 U.S. workers filed new jobless claims last week, with unemployment remaining historically high. On Thursday, Democratic leaders signaled they'll attempt to push Biden's proposed $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package through Congress by mid-March. An Arkansas man who boasted to reporters about looting the office of House Speaker Pelosi on January 6 will remain behind bars while he awaits trial. On Thursday, Chief U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell denied bail to Richard Barnett, who infamously posed for photos with his feet on Pelosi's desk and later showed off mail he'd stolen from her office. Judge Howell blasted Barnett as a brazen, entitled, dangerous, and a braggart who showed a total disregard for the law and the U.S. Constitution. She added, quote, "We're still living here in D.C. with the consequences of the violence in which this defendant is alleged to have participated. I can still see heavily armed National Guard troops patrolling from my window," unquote. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi slammed her Republican counterparts for giving Georgia freshman Congressmember Marjorie Taylor Greene a seat on the Education Committee after she claimed that many mass shootings were fake.
Assigning her to the Education Committee when she has mocked the killing of little children at Sandy Hook Elementary School, when she has mocked the killing of teenagers in high school at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. What could they be thinking, or is thinking too generous a word for what they might be doing? It's absolutely appalling.
This comes as more disturbing revelations about Marjorie Taylor Greene have emerged from her social media history. In 2018, she falsely claimed a laser beam started the deadly campfire in California. Greene cited Rothschild Inc., a common anti-Semitic trope, as being responsible. In fact, Pacific Gas and Electric has pleaded guilty in the deaths of 84 people killed in the wildfire. The QAnon-supporting Congressmember has also backed calls for violence against Democrats, promoted other anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim conspiracy theories, and made racist remarks. House Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy signaled continuing loyalty to Donald Trump Thursday after a meeting with the former president at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. In a statement, Congressmember McCarthy said Trump would help a united conservative movement to elect Republicans to the House and Senate in 2022. McCarthy's visit came on the same day Florida Republican Congressmember Matt Gaetz led a rally at the Wyoming state capitol calling on voters to reject Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney during primary elections. Cheney's the third highest-ranking Republican leader in the House and was one of the 10 GOP lawmakers who voted to impeach the president for inciting the January 6 assault on the Capitol.
If you want to prove that you have the power, defeat Liz Cheney in this upcoming election, and Wyoming will bring Washington to its knees.
Congressmember Gaetz said he spoke with former President Trump ahead of the rally, and Donald Trump Jr. joined the rally by speakerphone. In India, farm workers taking part in a historic uprising called off a march to Parliament next week following deadly violence during a protest earlier this week that left one person dead and hundreds injured. The head of the Farmers Union condemned the violence, which saw some farmers break off from the main protest and breach the historic Red Fort complex, some driving tractors. Police pushed the farmers back with tear gas and batons. Indian police are using facial recognition technology to identify suspects in the Red Fort breach. Pakistan's Supreme Court ruled to release 4 men convicted of kidnapping and murdering Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl in 2002. His attackers famously recorded his beheading and sent the video to U.S. officials. The court cited insufficient evidence and inconsistencies in the case, which was re-examined last year. The White House described the decision to release the perpetrators as, quote, an affront to terrorism victims everywhere, and administration officials said they would seek to put one of the men, British national Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh, on trial in the United States. President Biden's expected to name Robert Malley, a former advisor in the Obama and Clinton administrations, as the U.S. Special Envoy on Iran. Malley was a key figure in negotiating the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which Trump unilaterally withdrew the U.S. from. Russian authorities are cracking down on TikTok and other social media sites ahead of planned anti-corruption and anti-dictatorship protests being planned for the weekend. Last weekend's rallies were met with extraordinary police violence and nearly 4,000 arrests after tens of thousands of people took to the streets of cities across 11 time zones in some of the biggest protests ever to challenge Vladimir Putin's rule. Police have stepped up arrests and home searches targeting supporters of opposition nationalist politician Alexei Navalny, who was arrested upon his return to Russia earlier this month after surviving an assassination attempt in 2020. Navalny says the attack using the Soviet-era nerve gas Novichok took place on Putin's orders. On Thursday, a court in Moscow ordered Navalny to be jailed for 30 days ahead of his trial. Navalny spoke by video link from jail.
I want to say one more time, you won't succeed in frightening us. In fact, we are the majority. You won't manage to frighten dozens of millions of people who were robbed by those in power, despite the fact that those people who are now under arrest faced hardships.
In Germany, a neo-Nazi who murdered regional political official Walter Lübcke has been sentenced to life in prison. Stefan Ernst shot Lübcke on the terrace of his house in 2019. Lübcke has been targeted by far-right extremists over his support of Chancellor Angela Merkel's immigration policy, which opened Germany's doors to asylum seekers during the 2015-16 refugee crisis. A Dutch appeals court has ruled Shell is responsible for oil spills in 2004 and 2005 in Nigeria's Niger Delta and must pay damages. The case was brought by Friends of the Earth and Nigerian farmers who were seeking compensation for the leaks that contaminated their land and deprived them of income. The ruling could lead to more cases against Royal Dutch Shell. General Motors said Thursday it'll stop manufacturing cars that produce tailpipe emissions by 2035 as part of a pledge to become carbon neutral by 2040. GM's move to all-electric cars could cause other major automakers to follow suit. A recent report by the Union of Concerned Scientists found electric cars generate half the emissions of the average comparable gasoline car, even when pollution from battery manufacturing is accounted for. Lawmakers are demanding a congressional investigation into the trading app Robinhood after it stopped allowing users to purchase stock in the video game retailer GameStop and other companies. GameStop's share prices have swung dramatically in recent weeks, at one point surging by over 1,800% after amateur investors on Reddit boosted its price, costing billions of dollars in losses to major hedge funds that were betting on its share price to fall. A class action suit brought Thursday accuses Robinhood of manipulating the open market to benefit hedge funds at the expense of amateur traders. New York Democratic Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted in response, quote, "Gotta admit, it's really something to see Wall Streeters with a long history of treating our economy as a casino complain about a message board of posters also treating the market as a casino." She added, quote, "Anyways, tax the rich," unquote. In media news, the Daily Beast reports New York Times science and health reporter Donald McNeil Jr. was under investigation over offensive and racist comments he allegedly made while leading a trip to Peru with high school students in 2019. After the trip, several of the students told their parents McNeil had repeatedly made sexist comments and used the N-word. New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet said the investigation concluded McNeil's remarks were offensive and that he showed extremely poor judgment, but it did not appear to me that his intentions were hateful, he said. McNeil has been at the paper since 1976 and is now a top coronavirus correspondent. In more media news, two top executives at CBS were suspended earlier this week over accusations of sexist and racist behavior and following an investigation by the Los Angeles Times detailing how the two executives continuously bullied women journalists, blocked promotions for black journalists, and made racist comments. Peter Dunn, president of the CBS television stations, and David Friend, senior vice president of news, have been placed on administrative leave while a third-party investigation is ongoing. In Texas, the Austin City Council voted earlier this week to buy a hotel that'll serve as permanent housing for dozens of chronically unhoused people and use money taken from the city's police budget to provide resources for the people who will live in the hotel. The council back in August voted to cut some $100 million from the police department's budget. A recurring $6.5 million payment from those cuts is being set aside to fund permanent supportive housing and other services for unhoused people. In Georgia, at least 6 people were killed after a liquid nitrogen leak at a Gainesville poultry processing plant Thursday. Nearly a dozen others were sent to the hospital. The plant is owned by the Foundation Food Group. Mexican officials said at least 2 of the workers who died were from Mexico. Most of the workforce in Gainesville's meat processing plants are Latinx. In 2019, 4 in every 100 meat processing plant workers in the U.S. recorded a workplace injury, and at least 12 people died at the workplace. An award-winning African-American actress, Cicely Tyson, who was born and raised in Harlem, New York, has died at the age of 96. In 1974, Cicely Tyson won 2 Emmy Awards for perhaps her best-known role as the lead character in the TV drama The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. Tyson also had a supporting role in the 1977 television miniseries Roots. Cicely Tyson has played many acclaimed TV and movie roles, consistently portraying positive images of African-American women. In 2005, Cicely Tyson spoke at a memorial service for the late Rosa Parks at the Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C.
I do believe that the reason why Rosa Parks did not move when ordered to do so was because she knew that King Jesus was her driver. And she was not to move. She was like a tree planted by the water. And she was not to be moved. I tell you, she was climbing Jacob's ladder, and she was not to be moved. Climbing Jacob's ladder, and she was not to be moved. I have to tell you that last night, yesterday, when I viewed her body, I was stunned by the strength that came from her face. Even in death, it was there.
The late Cicely Tyson speaking at the memorial service for Rosa Parks in 2005. Democracy Now! Was there. Cicely Tyson has died at the age of 96. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, we spend the rest of the hour with filmmakers behind the remarkable new documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray, exploring the life of Pauli Murray, a groundbreaking legal scholar who influenced Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Thurgood Marshall, and their largely unexplored experience as a non-binary Black person. Stay with us.
This train is a clean train. This train is a clean train. This train is a clean train. Everybody ride it in Jesus' name. This train is a clean train. This train is bound for glory. This train Brother Spain, is bound for glory. You know this train is bound for glory. Everybody right here.
This trained by Sister Rosetta Tharpe. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. One of President Biden's first steps in his first week in office was to end the Trump ban on transgender people serving in the U.S. military and issue an executive order to clarify protections for trans people in the workplace, schools, in health care, and more. He also signed 4 executive orders to advance what the White House calls his racial equity agenda. The moves are steps on a long path toward equality, and today we spend the hour looking back on one of the most pivotal figures in the history of this struggle, Pauli Murray, a trailblazing Black, queer, feminist, poet, lawyer, and legal scholar, and priest, who was discriminated against from childhood because of their race or gender or both, and went on to question systems of oppression and conformity with a radical vision ahead of their time that influenced landmark civil rights decisions and gender equality legislation that transformed our world. As a civil rights pioneer, Pauli Murray was arrested 15 years before Rosa Parks for refusing to give up a seat on a bus. Pauli later helped found the National Organization for Women. Pauli also became a priest and is now a saint in the Episcopal Church. Pauli Murray's story is told in a new documentary premiering at the Sundance Film Festival that opens this weekend, that features never-before-seen footage and audio recordings of Pauli Murray in their own words.
Can I take some close-ups of you without your glasses?
Lie down. Sit down. Lie down. Lie down. He has to be in everything. My name is Pauli Murray, and my field of concentration has been human rights. My whole personal history has been a struggle to meet standards of excellence in a society which has been dominated by the ideas that blacks were inherently inferior to whites and women were inherently inferior to men.
How influential was Pauli Murray in the fight for equality? They played a key role in developing Thurgood Marshall's arguments that led to the unanimous 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. And they inspired Ruth Bader Ginsburg's first argument before the Supreme Court as a lawyer that the Equal Protection Clause that made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race also made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex, a practice Pauli Murray called Jane Crow. Pauli Murray inspired so many people, yet their experience as a non-binary black person has often been overlooked. Their role in all of these histories has been overlooked. In a letter to their Aunt Pauline in 1943, Pauli Murray wrote, "I don't know whether I'm right or whether society or some medical authority is right. I only know that how I feel and what makes me happy. This conflict rises up to knock me down at every apex I reach in my career. And because the laws of society do not protect me, I'm exposed to any enemy or person who may or may not want to hurt me," they wrote. In the new documentary, I Am Pauli Murray, trans activist and writer Raquel Wellis and queer and trans writer Dolores Chandler share how Pauli Murray is also a hero to many in today's trans rights movement.
As a trans, gender nonconforming, queer person of mixed race myself, I thought, this is a feeling I know well. We've been taught to believe that people like us don't exist. So when I came to know and learn about Pauli Murray, I was so amazed and wanted to hold it so tightly. And also I was angry. I was so angry that I felt in some ways that I had been robbed of a part of my history. I identify with the turmoil of someone who was trying to live life as a complete being with an integrated body, mind, and spirit. If Pauli Murray were sitting here today and I said, Pauli, what pronouns do you use? I don't know what Pauli Murray would say.
Being Black and queer myself, I refer to Pauli as they or simply Pauli to acknowledge their expansive gender experience.
That's Raquel Willis and Dolores Chandler in the new film, My Name is Pauli Murray. Dolores is the former coordinator of the Pauli Murray Center and joins us now from Durham, North Carolina. We're also joined by the film's directors and producers, Julie Cohen and Betsy West. The film grew out of their Academy Award-nominated documentary, RBG. I Am Pauli Murray is premiering at the Sundance Film Festival, one of the premier film festivals in the world, which has just started, and it's taking place, well, mostly online due to the pandemic. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Betsy West, I wanted to begin with you. Talk about how you learned about Pauli Murray and the trajectory that this film has taken following your critically acclaimed film, RBG.
Well, we learned about Pauli Murray from RBG. As you mentioned, RBG credited Pauli Murray with ideas about using the 14th Amendment to win equal rights for women. And in fact, RBG put Pauli Murray's name on the cover of the first brief that she wrote before the Supreme Court in Reed v. Reed. So, Julie and I heard the name and learned a little bit, but after the documentary RBG was finished, we started to do a little more investigating, and it didn't take long to realize that this chapter in Pauli's life was just one of an extraordinary series of events. And we just thought, well, first of all, wow, why didn't we know about Pauli Murray? And what an amazing story. And would it be possible to make a documentary about Pauli?
I actually wanted to go to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Shortly after the Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, died last year, Time magazine published a never-before-seen interview with RBG from 2017 talking about how Pauli Murray influenced her.
The 14th Amendment contains my favorite clause of the Constitution, nor shall any state deny any person the equal protection of the laws. Pauli had the idea that we should interpret the text literally. It said any person, not any male person. She wrote this remarkable article called Jane Crow and the Law, where she called attention to all the laws that restricted what women could do. Reed v. Reed was the turning point gender discrimination case in the Supreme Court. I wrote the brief in Sally Reed's case. I put on the cover Pauli Murray's name. By the time of Reed, Pauli had already changed her interest. She was going to divinity school. She was into ministry, not lawyering. But we knew when we were writing that brief that we were standing on her shoulders.
Yes, that's none other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg speaking to the filmmakers Margot Guernsey and Llewellyn Smith back in 2017. RBG is also featured in My Name is Pauli Murray. So, Julie Cohen, if you can take us back, I mean, what is astounding about this, and I'm sure for many around the world who are watching or listening to this or reading about it right now, is this is the first time they are hearing Pauli Murray's name. Yet, named by RBG as one of her inspirations, and then go back in time to Thurgood Marshall, and before that as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, certainly there is a growing awareness among progressives in the U.S., Episcopals, people who live in Durham, North Carolina, pockets of extreme interest and academics who are interested in Pauli Murray. But the fact is, most of us We're not taught about Pauli Murray in our elementary school history classes, as perhaps we should have been, or later in our schooling. And yet, this is a person who influenced so many different movements in the U.S., not only, as you were talking about, the fight for gender equality, but also the fight for racial equality. When Pauli Murray was at Howard Law School in the early 1940s, Pauli wrote a paper making the argument that Plessy versus Ferguson should be overturned, that 1896, the notorious 1896 Supreme Court case laying down the rule of separate but equal. The feeling of the early civil rights movement at that point was what we should be fighting for in the separate but equal realm is to sort of, improve the conditions in segregated institutions. Pauli Murray's argument was, no. This whole construct is faulty. Separate but equal, by definition, is unfair. And by keeping people separate, you are treating them unequally. You're creating a stamp or a badge of inferiority, telling people that you have to, people need to be going to their own corners. Pauli's teachers and classmates at Howard Law School thought this idea too radical. In Pauli's description, there was laughter and mocking. Pauli said, I think that Plessy is going to be overturned. I think within 25 years was Pauli's guess. One of Pauli's professors made a $10 wager saying, no, absolutely no way. Of course, 10 years later, 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling came out saying exactly that. Separate but equal is unconstitutional. And Pauli's law professors had been were involved in that case. Spotswood Robinson, who was Pauli's professor at Howard, Thurgood Marshall, also teaching at Howard, like all the great civil rights, icons were very much circling around Howard University. And in fact, Pauli's paper was used in developing the arguments that went into the Brown versus Board of Education brief. There's sort of specific points that Pauli makes that actually find their way into the formal brief and then into the Supreme Court ruling.
I want to turn to an audio clip of Pauli Murray speaking in 1966 at the Harvard Law Forum.
Nature does not ask us where she distributes brains, intellect, talent, drive. She simply scatters these with the recombination of the genes. In some ways, I might have been disadvantaged to have been born a Negro in white America, a woman in a man's profession, left-handed in a right-handed world, and I might throw in even an orphan at an early age. But there were certain advantages in this status, which I didn't see then, but I see in retrospect. I therefore came to sex discrimination much later than I came to race discrimination. And having fought the battle of race discrimination, I began to see how integrally these two discriminations were. Since I could not split myself, and since I had to be a unified human being, I decided that it was not I that was wrong, but the society that was wrong. And that any time a society penalizes an individual because of a biological attribute, whether it be race per se or whether it be sex per se, that society is going to be challenged.
So that was Pauli Murray speaking at a Harvard Law Forum. Pauli Murray went to Howard Law School. In the 40s, Pauli Murray wrote a letter to Harvard Law School after being rejected for a further degree. At the time, the school only accepted men. Pauli wrote, quote, I would gladly change my sex to meet your requirements, but since the way to such change has not been revealed to me, I have no recourse but to appeal to you to change your minds. Now, this is not a minor point. She is prevented from going to Harvard Law School because of, they said they would not accept women to Harvard Law School. She would go to the University of California, Berkeley, then get another degree at Yale. Now a building is named for Pauli Murray, the first African-American named on a building is named for. Betsy West, if you could talk about a lot of what's embedded in what Pauli Murray is saying. Now, Pauli Murray at the time referred to herself as she, but this is at a time when she had asked for testosterone treatment, when they had asked for testosterone treatment, when they were asking doctors, could it be that, in fact, I am male? When there was an appendix problem, begging the doctor to do exploratory surgery to see if perhaps they had male genitalia inside.
Yeah, as you said, this was a struggle that Pauli went through privately. Pauli wrote about civil rights, women's rights, her fight for those things. But at the same time, as a young woman, Pauli was experiencing the feelings, hey, I'm a man. And in Pauli's 30s and 40s, consulting a series of doctors, it was really extraordinary to read the letters that are in the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, where Pauli's archive resides, in a folder that Pauli saved for posterity to read, her struggle to find an answer to the feelings that Pauli had at the time. I mean, you have to remember in the 1930s and 1940s, there was no language, there were no words to describe the feelings that Pauli had from the time that she was a little girl, and something that was a private struggle that now, thanks to her saving all of this, we know about. And I think many people in the trans community will hear about, have identified with very strongly. You heard from Dolores earlier. Look forward to hearing from Dolores now.
And I want to bring Dolores into this conversation now. Dolores Chandler, you were the project coordinator at the Pauli Murray Project in Durham. I wanted to read a quote to you from another person featured in the film, the well-known attorney who we just had on this week from the ACLU, Chase Strangeview, who tweeted, "I hope everyone gets to learn about Pauli Murray, one of my heroes. I also think it's wrong to refer to Pauli with she, her pronouns. I hope we move away from that. We owe Pauli the respect to hold the capaciousness of Pauli's experiences in the world." Dolores, talk about how you learned about Pauli Murray, your feelings at the time, not having grown up with her as here I use the term her, because she herself earlier. But in this day and age, as Chase Strangeview says, do not use those pronouns. Your thoughts?
So to go back to how I learned about Pauli Murray, I, was really introduced to who Pauli Murray is and was in 2013 when I learned about the Pauli Murray Project. And I think that for me, as I mentioned in the documentary, there was a real clear moment of recognition in the sense that here was this person who, and I think that, Raquel Willis really uses the perfect word, expansive. Here's this person who is so expansive in their being, not just in terms of gender, but in terms of every a person who's become so integral in almost every aspect of our culture, and to recognize somebody who is holding a sense of turmoil around something that is very integral to their being. And what Polly talks about is the necessity to be to not fragment themselves, and to be integral or integrated into body, mind, and spirit. And so I think the ask to refer to Polly with gender-neutral pronouns as opposed to with she, her pronouns is an ask to acknowledge the complexity and the fullness and expansiveness of who Polly was as a person.
And talk about your thoughts, Dolores, and your feelings when you first learned about Polly Murray, how you came to be at the time the project coordinator at the Polly Murray Project in Durham, North Carolina.
So I came to be in that position really through my field internship. I was in a social work program at UNC at the time, and I had been invited to participate in a weekend-long sort of discussion where there were people from disciplines relevant to Polly Murray's life. So I spent the weekend with lawyers and priests and theologians. And I also was showing up not just as a social worker, but as a community organizer and performer. And we were all talking about the impact that Polly Murray had on our lives and on our fields and our disciplines. And I think that for the first time ever, was introduced to this person who not once ever really compromised who they were in order to achieve what they were trying to achieve in the world. And I think that when you're someone, in my social work program, I was at the time the only out gender nonconforming, also queer person of color in the program. And so when you're the only one of your kind in a space, it is a very isolating and lonely experience. And to then encounter someone like Polly Murray and to recognize that there were people like me and people like us who have come before us, but because of the way our society is constructed, our presence and our identities and the wholeness of who we are is often treated as either irrelevant or lacking in value. We trans and gender nonconforming folks are forced to sort of, in a lot of ways, navigate this world with the belief that we're an aberration or an anomaly, or don't actually make significant contributions to culture, to society, or to policies. And then to turn around and find this person who experienced a similar turmoil, I thought to myself, oh, this is a lie. Like to be treated as though trans people don't exist, or that trans people or gender nonconforming or non-binary people are a problem, or that their contributions are of value only insofar as we brush aside or we don't talk about those parts of that person that make us really uncomfortable or that we don't understand, is forces that fragmentation and ultimately is a violence. So when I learned about Polly Murray, if I could have, if that had been an in-person meeting, I would have just fully embraced Polly and hugged Polly so tightly to myself, because that was a life-giving moment for me.
Dolores Chandler, we're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Now, Dolores, a social worker and equity facilitator and trainer, the former coordinator of the Pauli Murray Project, the Pauli Murray Center. That's talked about in My Name is Pauli Murray. That is premiering at the Sundance Film Festival this weekend. When we come back, not only a pioneering legal scholar, but also an Episcopal priest, now saint. We'll hear from Michael Curry. Stay with us.
If not now, then when? If not today, then why make your promises? A love declared for days to come is as good as none. You can wait till morning comes. You can wait for the new day. You can wait and lose this heart. You can wait and soon be sorry. 'Cause if not now, then when? If not today, then why make your promises? A love declared for days to come is as good as none.
If Not Now by Tracy Chapman. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we spend the hour looking at a person written out of history books, but was so pivotal in the history of the struggle for equal rights in this country, Pauli Murray, the trailblazing Black, queer, feminist poet, lawyer, and legal scholar and priest who influenced landmark civil rights decisions and gender equality legislation that transformed our world. Late in life, after being a tenured professor at Brandeis University, Pauli Murray became a priest in the Episcopal Church, now considered a saint. This is Episcopal Bishop Michael Curry speaking about Murray's legacy in the fight for civil rights.
Long before, almost 10 years before, Rosa Parks sat down and refused to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Pauli Murray sat down on a bus and refused to give up her seat, refusing to sit in the segregated section. She anticipated movements that would come years later. She sowed the seeds for change that would eventually happen. It was Pauli Murray who produced the seminal study of segregation laws throughout the United States that formed much of the basis for the legal work of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that went into the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Pauli Murray did most of that legal research on civil rights, on segregation laws that needed to be overturned. That was Pauli Murray. She anticipated change that would impact both civil rights, but women's rights, and eventually LGBTQ rights. She anticipated all of those things in her legal work, in her legal writings. Her friendship with the late Eleanor Roosevelt was a friendship that was built on a mutual commitment to values of a humane and a decent world. She worked assiduously for that kind of world, even though she herself did not actually see it. She wrote and worked for the equality of women and for equity. In fact, there's a new commentary, a new article I saw the other day that has Ruth Bader Ginsburg referring to Pauli Murray as one of her heroines, if you will, in the struggle and in the work. She's an unsung hero for the rights and the equity of women, an unsung hero for the rights and the equality and equity of all people in this country. an unsung hero for the rights of LGBTQ people in this country. She anticipated it. She saw it before it happened, and she worked for something that she would never see, but she did it so that some of us might actually see it.
That's Bishop Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, talking about Pauli Murray. Bishop Curry became global when he gave the sermon at the royal wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. This is Democracy Now! As we continue with the directors of the new film, My Name is Pauli Murray, Julie Cohen and Betsy West. Their new documentary premiering at Sundance Film Festival this weekend, and we're joined by one of the subjects in the film about Pauli Murray, Dolores Chancellor, who is featured in that documentary, former coordinator of the Pauli Murray Center in Durham, North Carolina, now a social worker and equity facilitator and trainer. Julie, the life trajectory of Pauli Murray, it is just absolutely incredible, and incredible that we, unless in different worlds, closer in those worlds, legal worlds, women's rights world, so many have not known about Pauli Murray. When Pauli Murray was rejected by Harvard for being a woman, they were doing that even though FDR, the President of the United States, wrote a letter to Harvard to say that Pauli Murray should be accepted. Pauli Murray was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, who sent flowers to Pauli Murray when they graduated from Howard Law School. Not only was Pauli Murray a professor at Brandeis, but she also lived in Ghana. If you can just talk about that part of the trajectory, and then deciding to become an Episcopal priest in the later years.
Yeah, there is so much to this trajectory that it's, as you're seeing, hard to fit into a segment of a show, hard to fit into a film. Every single chapter more fascinating than the last. Pauli was motivated to move to uproot and move to Ghana in the late 1950s. At the time, Pauli was working as an associate at the prestigious New York law firm Paul Weiss. A period of life where, for the first time, despite making so many contributions, often Pauli was struggling to have enough money to pay the rent. And finally, at Paul Weiss, was making a great living, not feeling hugely fulfilled by the work, but certainly was intellectually engaged. And then in 1959, a man named Mac Parker was lynched in Mississippi. A big national news story at the time that there would be, this brutal lynching as late as 1959. And it just shook Pauli's world. And that led to the thought of, you know what, not only I want to change my career path, but I actually want to get out of the country for a while. Pauli took up an offer to go to the forming new law school in Accra, Ghana, and was there for 18 months teaching constitutional law concepts to African law students. Ran into some trouble with the not so interested in constitutional democratic principles government of Ghana at the time, and decided it would be safer to come back to America. That was the period when Pauli got a doctorate at Yale Law School. And as you say, moved into academics. We're leaving out of this, every time I say something, I think of a chapter that we're not mentioning of all the accomplishments we've talked about. Pauli was also an unbelievable published writer of both memoirs and poetry. And after becoming a tenured professor at Brandeis, as you say, made the decision that at the core of everything Pauli had fought for through life, the activist struggles and the legal struggles, maybe politics and law weren't the best way to achieve the huge, monumental societal shifts that Pauli and others in the movement were seeking. And maybe spirituality and and God were the answers. And that's what led Pauli to divinity school at a time when women, and remember that Pauli was identifying in the world as a woman at the time, at the time Pauli started divinity school, the Episcopal Church was not ordaining women. Fortunately, by the time that Pauli got the degree, Pauli was in fact ordained as an Episcopal priest. And those who knew her, we interview, or knew Pauli, we interview Pauli's grandniece in the film, saying that becoming a priest really shifted Pauli's perspective and really turned Pauli from a talker to a listener, and, you know, mellowed Pauli, but not in a way that quieted Pauli, but in the way like a mellowed activist.
And through all of this period, I mean, the decades, what's so astounding at how much Pauli Murray accomplished, an amazing memoirist, journaler, as you said, poet, was institutionalized, would get depressed, had relationships when they ended with women, fell apart. Can you talk about overcoming all of this?
You know, Pauli.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Julie. Sorry.
You know, it was really the spirituality that helped Pauli overcome loss and struggle, and I think that's where it was after the death of a 15-year partner, Irene Barlow, that Pauli went to divinity school and found in the church solace from some of the lifelong struggle.
And Betsy, you wanted to add, and the issue of being institutionalized, and also understanding their just talking to medical doctors all through this period.
You can only imagine how incredibly frustrating and difficult it was for Pauli to have this strong feeling of being a man and not getting any kind of validation for this. And yes, Pauli was in and out of institutions, suffering breakdowns basically in the 1930s and into the 40s. Eventually, Pauli did find this love relationship with Irene Barlow, which, as Julie said, lasted for 15 years. And I think that was a great solace for Pauli. I also think that the move, Pauli had always been religious, had gone to the Episcopal Church, had found actually the relationship with Irene. They shared a passion for religion, used to go to church together. I also think that it gave Pauli space to devote herself to Pauli's autobiography, which she spent the last few years, Pauli's life, writing very seriously. In one interview, we heard Pauli was introduced as a lawyer turned poet. She said, "No, I'm a poet turned lawyer." For Pauli, writing was probably the most important form of expression. Pauli had written an amazing family memoir, Proud Shoes, which is kind of like the precursor to Roots, an extraordinary story of her own family, mainly in the 19th century, and then went on to finish her autobiography, which was extremely important to Pauli.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but people should begin to explore. Betsy West and Julie Cohen are the award-winning directors of the new documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray, premiering at the Sundance Film Festival virtually this weekend. Thanks also to Dolores Chandler, the former coordinator of the Pauli Murray Center in Durham, featured in the film. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Tarasena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Charina Dudura, Sam Alcoff, Tam Maria Studio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Masood, and Adriana Couture. Special thanks to Julie Crosby and Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman. Be safe. Wear a mask. Try to.